All right. So I wanted to tell you that I joined INSEAD in June, but I actually have my roots here. I had my PhD from INSEAD in 2007. So when I was asked to give this talk, I thought about telling you a story, which pretty much relates to how I ended up doing this type of research, which would also help kind of pass some more critical information about these circular economy type initiatives, their history, and where they're leading us to, right? But what I want to do here is something of interactive nature. So please feel free to jump in and ask questions, and I will ask you questions as well. The idea is really, in the interactive format is to give you a perspective from the consumer side, from the business side, from a social entrepreneurship side, or from a policy side, just to show that how these issues encompass the overall business spectrum largely, okay? So I wanted to start the story with this picture. This is from 2005. This is the summer that I got made. Actually, this picture was taken by my wife during my honeymoon. And this was a long summer vacation. I remember Luc, my PhD advisor, criticizing me for taking a 2-month vacation in the second year of my PhD. So this is interesting in the sense that what I'm doing there is hugging a tree. Right? This is the time, the time of my PhD program where I started hearing so much about tree hugging. Okay? So this was a joke in reference to the tree hugging story at large. What was happening then was I was starting to engage in something called the WEEE directive, which was kind of a surprise for me as well. Because when I started my PhD, the first thing I did was to look at the Kodak single-use camera system. And that was actually the first chapter of my dissertation. Do you guys remember the Kodak single-use cameras? Have you used them? Right? It was a beautiful model, but it actually started from a very kind of environmentally harmful point. Kodak invented the single-use camera for literally one single use, but at some point the environmental advocacy group realized that it was creating a lot of waste. So these guys said, can we do something smart about it? And the idea was to redesign those single-use cameras to be reusable many times and create an infrastructure utilizing the photo developers, the Photoshops, to collect those cameras back so that they could take them into their refurbishing or recycling facilities, and they would bring them back to the market. It was a fantastic idea, and we called it a closed-loop supply chain at the time. So we basically looked at a problem where we tried to optimize the durability of the product, as well as the access to single-use cameras, as well as how the market would respond to these kind of products as well. So it was interesting, and I presented it in an academic workshop, which had some practitioner attendance as well. Coincidentally, at the time, there was someone from Bosch Tools North America. The guy approached me after my presentation and said, look, this is very interesting, but there is a different story, there's a different part to the story in that you also need to understand markets function differently when it comes to products that are distinguishable. Distinguishable meaning, if with a single-use camera, you were using a recycled camera, but you didn't know about it, or you didn't notice it, right? Because it was a perfect substitute to the original product. Whereas when it comes to other products, such as power tools, or cell phones, or computers, they are distinguishable when they are refurbished, or when they contain refurbished components. You also legally need to declare them, right? So then we said, okay, what is different here? He said, well, it's interesting because there's a strategic component to this in that it matters so much for our competition. When we look at refurbishing power tools at Bosch Tools North America, we check whether or not there is a third-party competitor out there that is strong enough, especially Asian manufacturers that would produce lower quality and cheaper tools that were cannibalizing the high quality and more expensive power tools. These guys were refurbishing their own products and putting them back to the market. The idea was very simple. If there's competition out there from a low-quality competitor, I can use the refurbished products as a competitive weapon against those guys. That's what he said. So then I wrote a paper, which became my job market paper in academia, actually. And I started basically with those two coincidental stories, becoming a closed-loop supply chain person. But right before this picture was taken, I was walking in INSEAD towards the Camembert area. I saw a sign that was standing, which said WEEE Forum. I did not know what it was about. But when I looked at who was organizing it, it turned out it was my advisor, my PhD advisor, Luc, at the time. So I looked at it, well, what is this WEEE? And I asked Luc. He said, it's about European regulation. I said, what is wrong with you? I thought you were a supply chain person. Why would you deal with regulation issues? What do we have to do with policy on the operations side of the spectrum? He said, why don't you come and take a look? So I went in there, and I started hearing people talking about hugging trees. And this was the context. I'm going to show you a video now to explain the context to you, what was going on. What I want you to do is, whatever you do, if you're an academic, if you're a business person, if you're into policy, whatever it is, forget about it, take that hat off, and put a consumer hat on. Right? Think about this issue with your consumer identity, and tell me what you think. This is a disturbing scene, disturbing video, which is intended to actually give you some discomfort. But it is important for setting the stage. And it is very important for setting the stage, the circular economy idea. We're going to take about 10 minutes watching this video. And share your reactions as consumers.
All of us have faced the problem. Your favorite computer breaks or cannot cope with the latest software requirements and has become hopelessly obsolete. You'll find that it costs more to repair or upgrade your unit than replacing it with the latest model. So reluctantly, perhaps, you get rid of it. In the United States, it is estimated that 5 to 7 million tons of what is being called electronic waste, or e-waste, becomes obsolete every year. And it is believed that the volumes of e-wastes are rising at a rate of 3 to 5% per year. So how does one get rid of an old computer or other electronic device? If you're conscientious, you'll likely do a little research, a few phone calls to your city or counting agencies, and you'll discover an interesting fact. Computer waste is, in fact, hazardous. Indeed, it is not well known that computers contain substantial amounts of very serious pollutants. Computer monitor glass and circuit boards contain so much lead, for example, that they readily qualify computers as hazardous wastes. So, invariably, you'll be told that rather than place your e-waste in a trash can and contribute to polluting our environment through your local landfill, you should send your e-waste to your local recycler. That sounds good. But what they don't tell you is that e-waste recyclers are, for the most part, not recyclers so much as they are waste distribution centers.
So when you get rid of your used computers and take it to a proper recycling stream, in Europe, in the United States, in Asia, wherever you live, where do you think these used computers or anything electronic ends up? Well, the beginning of the video should have given you a clue, right? Where does it go? Or how does it go? It ends up somewhere in Asia, most likely nearby a port in China or somewhere in Africa, right? And what happens here is these recycling entities, whether they are part of a legal collection and recycling stream or not, end up having to dispose of these materials by selling them to brokers, right? So in what format they sell these used materials is going to depend on the technology available to the recycler. Some recyclers who are capable of disassembling the computers or monitors will take away valuable parts, such as the copper yoke behind the LCD, for instance, or the circuit boards, which contain chips and other precious materials, metals in them, and so on. Some of them will actually just put them through a shredder and utilize shredding and extrusion to separate valuable metals. But what happens to the materials that are not valuable is the real question, right? Where do they end up? So if you're able to separate, disassemble, and shred, and identify the valuable components and separate them from the others, you will sell the valuable materials to one broker that will actually take it to the commodity market. The others will be sold. The parts or materials that are not valuable or costly to process will be sold to some other broker. Okay? If you don't have the shredding capability, then you're going to sell the whole product or the whole components as is to another broker that will actually send them over to their own recyclers. Okay? So most of those, their own recyclers are located in the developing world, somewhere out there, where manual labor is used to process the valuable and non-valuable materials. So what these guys do, this is an organization called the Basel Action Network, is to track where these materials are being shipped through legal or illegal entities that are engaged in recycling. Okay? So the following part of the video shows you what is happening in case of China.
A global watchdog group dedicated to preventing toxic trades of all kinds decided to conduct a field investigation. Following up news articles and emails from mainland China, ban was directed to an e-waste processing area known as Guayu on the Longdong River near the city of Shantao in the northeast Guangdong province, 4 hours by car from Hong Kong. In the course of 3 intensive days in and around Guayu's 4 villages, the small investigative team witnessed firsthand what passes for recycling of e-waste in Asia. By this investigation, they were for the first time able to provide the Western world with more than just a guess of what the underbelly of our consumptive cyber age lifestyle really looks like. 6 years ago, Guayu was a peaceful rice-growing village. But life in Guayu changed dramatically when it began receiving its first truckloads of imported e-waste. Guayu has now been transformed into a bustling, sprawling junkyard for much of the world's electronic discards. Lured by the possibility of making $1.50 for a day's work, residents of rural farming provinces migrate to Guayu to toil long hours breaking e-waste down to the component materials of steel, aluminum, copper, plastic, and gold. The operations are primitive, labor-intensive, and of a small scale. However, taken as a whole, the sheer number of the individual operations in the Guayu area is impressive and significant. It is estimated that 100,000 people make their living scrapping e-waste here.
So 100,000 people scrapping e-waste for $1.50 a day, right? That's what we're seeing. So is this a good thing or a bad thing? This used to be a fishing village until 6 years ago, right? But these people, about 100,000 of them, chose to move out of the fishing business and started disassembling computers and processing electronic waste. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Bad.
Why is it bad? Nobody forced them to, right?
They're earning more per month than they used to.
Okay.
Multiplies over $30 per month. So.
Yeah.
But there's no protection in place for workers.
Okay, absolutely. So the reason why these people are working for $1.50 in China is the fact that if you were to do the same thing in a developed country, any recycler would have to create a system that follows the safety and security and health standards, and it would cost the recycler out there maybe $50 a day, right? So when the health and safety regulations are not present, this is what's going to happen.
Guayu has been undrinkable and has to be trucked in from a town 30 kilometers away.
Groundwater has been contaminated.
Water tanks hauled by tractors are a constant sight on the streets of Guayu.
He's transporting water into the village.
Remember, this was a fishing village.
I asked him why. Do you take water to sell it there? And he said the water there tastes no good.
And how long have they been transporting water into the village?
They've been doing it for 5 years now.
And how long has the electronic waste been in this village?
According to the other man that we interviewed, 5 to 6 years.
But although the drinking water is no longer drinkable and the air smells foul, the populace of Guayu is still largely ignorant of the health impacts of the imported poisons. The investigation sought to take a closer look at the different e-waste recycling processes employed in Guayu to better understand their impacts. What was found in just a short time proved to be cause for alarm. Cathode ray tubes, or CRTs, which make up the bulk of a typical computer monitor or television, are the most well-known of e-waste hazards, as they contain between 4 to 8 pounds of toxic metal lead. For this reason, CRTs are considered a hazardous waste in international law, and certain states in the U.S. are beginning to forbid their disposal in landfills. Contrary to what was expected, the investigative team could find scant evidence that CRTs were being reused or refurbished. Although it's possible that such an activity takes place elsewhere, what was witnessed in Guayu was the daily breaking by hand of hundreds of CRTs without any special protection. The object of all this was simply to remove the copper-laden yoke at the end of the glass tube funnel for its copper value alone. Following the cracking operation, the monitor glass was not recycled in any way. Rather, this leaded, hazardous glass material was simply thrown into irrigation canals and along riversides. Helps the processing of electronic printed circuit boards. After the circuit boards are pulled from the computers, they are then handled by one
We
of
moved
the
on to the
hundreds
next part of the
desoldering
process.
laborers operating all over town. The circuit boards are placed over a coal-fired grill until the solder melts. Then the chips are plucked from the boards for later sorting. Some of the workers use fans to blow the fumes away, but inhalation of the lead, tin, solder vapors is inevitable, as is the ambient fallout of the heavy metals over the entire community. After the valuable chips are removed, the boards are often burned to recover residual solder and discarded in the environment. Here along the river, even after a government cleanup operation, massive piles of charred circuit boards lie dumped, reduced to ashen fiberglass skeletons. Analysis of the river water, soil, and sediment samples here revealed alarming levels of heavy metals. Soil here had levels of lead more than 200 times the level at which the Dutch government considers sediment to be a hazardous waste. River water here was found to be 2,400 times the World Health Organization's threshold level for lead in drinking water. Once the computer chips and connectors are cut or peeled off the circuit boards, they're then either sold for reuse or, more often, sold to the acid strippers. These cyber-age gold miners are found operating on the riverbanks just outside of town. Here, over small fires, they heat an ancient formula known as aqua regia, which is made up of 75% pure hydrochloric acid and 25% pure nitric acid. Aqua regia is swirled over the plastic tubs of computer chips to dissolve the tiny amounts of gold found inside. After many hours of this, a chemical is then added which precipitates the gold, making it settle to the bottom of the tub. This is recovered as a mud, dried, and then finally melted to a tiny bead of pure, shiny gold. Besides the highly corrosive acid fumes, the process emits sulfur dioxide and chlorine, both toxic gases. Yet the only worker protections used are rubber boots and gloves. The hazardous sludges from the process, including pure acids, heavy metals, and hydrocarbons, are simply dumped, blackening the riverbanks and soaking into the river.
Okay, now I'm testing the acidity of the water. It's almost zero, extremely, the highest scale in acidity that you can get. Now I'm placing the whole paper in. And this is just...
I think it's a good point to stop. I told you it was going to be pretty uncomfortable, right? So what do you think now with your consumer hats on? Yes?
I feel guilty.
You feel guilty?
I was considering buying an iPad today, and one of my friends suggested buying a refurbished one, like reused. And I had this in my mind, back of my mind, that no, I'll use it for like 5 years. I don't want to buy a second-hand product. And so if everyone has this mentality, how things will improve.
Okay. Any other reflections? Let me ask you more of a guiding question. So there can be two potential points of view when it comes to this, right? First, we could say that we in the developing economies should be responsible for those. Why are we letting these products leak into the developing economies, right? Another point of view, which I heard very often, is to say, Well, nobody's forcing these people, right? They're obviously making a living out of this, and there are people making money. So the societal angle is there because it's creating additional wealth for the individuals out there, right? But what do you think is the overall trend from a consumer perspective? Which point of view is more likely to be appreciated or supported by the general public or consumers today? That the developed economies should be responsible for this, or nobody is forcing the developing economies to accept these in there? Yes?
I think, luckily, that there is an increased sense of responsibility.
Where does the sense of responsibility come from, do you think? More information?
Yes.
Right. So I teach this in executive education in MBA classes and so on. And I used to teach this in the United States, where I worked as a faculty in the Southeast. And I can tell you, 10 years ago, the debate was about a 50-50 split in the classroom. Depending on your political point of view or the world view, you would support the market approach versus, we actually need to control the market somehow kind of approach. But in the last 3 to 4 years, I can very confidently say that it's about a 90 to 10%. Most often, the point of view that supports letting the markets decide on the fate of these things is actually disappearing, or potentially the peer pressure is not allowing people to speak up their opinions in the end. Right? But what we see more and more is that people think that the developed economies, United States, European Union, Japan, those should be taking more responsibility about this, right? So do we all agree on that point of view? One way or another, the developed economies will be responsible for those. But then, the developed economy being responsible effectively means that we should find a way to stop exporting these waste out of this economy, right? So if it's going to stay in this economy, it's going to be significantly more expensive. Is that right? For us to deal with that waste, because there are regulations here. You cannot really landfill these products in the European Union. So then the real question is, who is going to pay for these? Yes?
So I was reading about a startup in India. They are actually setting up these industries where they can recycle products. But the problem is they import waste from other countries because the waste in other countries is better segregated, so it's easier for them to make money. So they're taking subsidy from Indian government to set up the plants, but they're not actually working on the waste produced in India, and they're importing these.
Right.
So, like, even if the developed country, if the developing people are willing to do that, how can we stop it? Like, people in India want to import the waste from other countries.
Well, you basically create international regulations that would prevent those people from acquiring waste, and they would only get the valuable materials that they can process without harming the environment. That's actually the essence of the Basel Action Network's argument. And it was actually ratified in, I think, 2004 by something called the Basel Convention, right? The OECD members have ratified the Basel Convention with the exception of one country, right? Can you guess which country didn't? The US, absolutely, right? Everybody else signed it. But even though that international trade agreement is ratified, you still see the majority of waste, especially in the electronics context, leaking out of the developed economies somehow. Right? And the idea is very simple. You cannot really control what is valuable, what is environmentally harmful. Right? All they have to do is put those computers under the claim that they are in working condition, which is the case, right? I have a 286 processor computer in my grandmother's house. If I plug it in, it's still going to work, right? It still works, right? So it is a working condition product. But of course, the harmful substance in the monitor is the issue when it ends up in India, right? Those guys are going to take away the copper. They're going to trash the rest. All that lead and mercury, whatever is in there, is going to leak into the environment one way or another. That is the essence of the challenge, right? That is what we mean by asking the question of whether or not the developed economy should be doing something about this. And what the solution that most people agree is, yes, we should not let these things go out of our borders. Can we stop them? No. Why can't we stop them? Because separating valuable and useful materials from waste itself is a costly business. The scale of investment you need to put into the port of Amsterdam to prevent this from happening is incredible. Right? Do you want to pay for this? That's the real question. And that's exactly what I'm asking. So who should pay for this? If we keep them in-house, to be able to keep the harmful material in the developed economy, we need to pay for it. If we manage to keep everything in here, then we need to recycle them in a safe and environmentally responsible manner. Who should pay for those? Right? I have three options here. It could be, you can just say, let the state deal with it. You could say, let the manufacturers pay for it. Or you can say, well, the cost will be reflected on the consumers anyways, so why don't we just internalize those in the price of the products? Does that make sense? Can you speak louder? It is similar too. Yeah, but it's a burden on the manufacturers, right? If I'm a manufacturer, I'm going to say, why do I have to deal with it? Let's just put a additional price tag on the at the retail point, which says €5 will be used to pay for recycling those, which was the case for a long time in Europe too, especially in Belgium, right?
But it's not just the price, right? Like arranging everything is also a hassle in itself. Like
Yes, well,
manufacturers ready.
even better argument, a manufacturer can come and say recycling is a scale business. If you do it at the largest scale possible, which would be operationalized by the government, it is going to be the cheapest possible. So let the government deal with it by consumer funding, let's say.
Your question is then really not who should pay, but who should organize it, because in the end, consumer is going to pay anyway.
Yes. Okay. So what do you think the outcome will be if there was some form of regulation in place? Yes.
So in Toronto, I can't speak for the whole of Canada, but in
Right.
Toronto, every piece of electronics has a disposal tax, which is representative of the value of what you purchase. So it's essentially forced on a consumer. And one would have to imagine that a consumer would then take the step of disposing it properly at a designated waste collection site, which we do have. So ultimately, it goes back to, I believe, consumer behavior from the point of purchase all the way down to disposal.
Right.
Making it as easy and simple as possible.
Right. Luc, what is the outcome going to be in most practical examples that you know of? Who pays for this?
Well, in Europe, consumers are paying indirectly. The problem is how you organize the system, right? And you know
To your point.
a lot about that because we've worked on it for a long time and had some influence on the European legislation. At the end of the day, one of the big problems is that you cannot really stop it at the borders still. So there's still about 1/3 that escapes from Europe, I think.
Yeah.
And we don't really know exactly how much. So, yeah. And then, you could think about what about intellectual property, what about designing better products, and that's where you get into our field of expertise. And I'm sure you're going to talk about this.
Yes.
If one does incentivize or put it on the manufacturers, doesn't it also incite them to look at technological advances that will reduce the amount that they actually have to transform?
This is exactly the environmental economist angle that was put in place. So if you look at the majority of regulations around the world that organize this, for instance, 26 states in the United States have passed legislation that mandate producer responsibility for recycling electronics. 25 out of those holds producers accountable for organizing these systems and actually even paying for those costs, right? Be it financing internally or somehow reflecting it on the product price. But the argument that environmental economists have used for a long time is that it has to be a producer responsibility, a manufacturer responsibility model, so that they can find the incentive to change their product designs. Okay? The European Commission has passed this regulation, which mandates member states to create these systems. But all member states have chosen to push the responsibility on the producers as well. The idea being creating incentives to design out those environmental externalities can only be achieved if the producers are directly responsible to pay and to operationalize, going back to your question earlier. Okay? Now, yes?
But if producers are responsible, and now we're talking about rather short-term e-waste turning over, what in the case of more long-term e-waste or waste in which producers might disappear from the market? Or
there's always stipulations around how to deal with those, and this was part of the reason why I saw that sign at INSEAD, right? This is exactly the point at which you need an angle that differentiates the thinking around these issues from environmental economists, essentially, right? To an environmental economist, basically saying that find a way to pass the cost on the consumer, on the producers, they're going to find a way to solve the problem, right? But when it comes to execution or creating systems to solve these problems, you need an operational angle. And the point of orphans you raised was a big deal in those meetings. I think we spent 2 years at INSEAD in that WEEE forum, which I basically attended from 2004 until 2012. Because it was a beautiful research pool. There were lots of ideas around those. And I realized that every single question that was discussed there was operational, right? It was about taking a high-level policy idea, right, bringing it to execution, and the steps in between were all operational decision problems. And I'm going to give you some examples of those in a moment, too. But let's think about this for now. So if you agree that the producer's responsibility idea is going to be the regulation that is in place, what is the implication on the producers? What does that mean? I can give you a very simple example from energy regulation in the past, right? So if you look at the American energy marketplace, I think until mid-1960s, there was a very strong growth in terms of cost efficiency or the scale of these entities or of these facilities and so on. But mid-60s, you had the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts come in. Two environmental regulations coming into place, right? And all of a sudden, what you see is the efficiency of those electricity power generators, those factories, those plants started going down, and their costs started going up significantly. And do you see the parallel between the cost increase and the number of environmental regulations being enacted in that time frame? So there is a one-to-one correspondence between regulation coming into place and the cost efficiency of those producers disappearing. Now, for the electronics industry in particular, this was a major challenge because we are looking at early to late 2000s. This is where most computers, or the idea of a computer, has become more commoditized, right? Competition was intense, and the margins were shrinking. Market shares were quite even out there. So you're looking at an industry which has about 2 to 4% profit margin. If you impose recycling costs on those producers, what does that mean? If the recycling cost is 2% of your product price, your margin has gone, right? So this has very important, significant implications on the cost effectiveness and the competitiveness of the industry, not only within Europe, but also globally, right? If you're facing this cost here in the European market, you're not going to change your product designs only for the European market. You're going to go global, and it is going to affect your overall competitiveness with other firms, non-American firms, or in other markets significantly. So there are many challenges to this. But you need to think about the producer perspective at this point. So take off your consumer hats and put the producer hat on, okay? What is the producer going to do? Realizing that a green organization, an environmental organization, has stormed into a European Commission meeting and forced this idea into the European Commission agenda. And 2004, the WEEE directive, the Waste Electrical and Electronics Equipment Recycling Directive, has come into place, or is coming into place. What are you going to do as a producer? Right? I'm getting closer to the circular economy idea slowly, right? But I have to give you multiple perspectives at a time. What will your reaction be as a producer anticipating that a legislation of this sort is coming up? What are you going to do? Lobby for what? Lobby to prevent the regulation from happening, right? Many did so, right? And many of those were part of the forum that was happening at INSEAD. But a few didn't. The smarter ones, I would say. I won't name them because I managed to offend some good friends before by calling some firms smart and others not smart. But particularly one firm that understood the essence of these regulations went to the European Commission, collaborated with the environmental organizations, and lobbied for recycling regulation, but in one particular format. They said, recycling is a scale business, so we need to create collective systems where we would maximize the scale or the efficiency. Collective meaning every producer's product will be collected through one single stream system and also recycled, right? This is going to minimize the cost for everybody so that we don't have to deal with this significant cost increase issue. Right? That is going to maintain the European competitiveness as well. It sounds like a brilliant idea, right? Unfortunately, for that particular firm, it was a brilliant idea, but for many others, it was not. Here's why. Take two television manufacturers. One has sold 100 TVs this year with the old technology, cathode ray tube, CRTs, right? Historically, going back to your question, they had sold more TVs in the past, so they are getting more and more TVs coming back today. So they have about 50% of their sales volume coming back to be recycled this year, okay? Well, because their technology is older, cathode ray tube, it's also more expensive to recycle those products as well. Whereas there's another producer who is newer into that market, take some company like Samsung, for instance, who are selling LCDs, better technologies, cheaper to recycle, right? And they sell more, absolutely, because their market share is higher, and they get fewer returns because their technology is also newer, not older products, right? So how are you going to create a system, a collective system, that is going to recycle this mix of two producers' products? That company who lobbied for the regulation went for something called a market share-based allocation. Okay? So what does that mean? Just look at what I'm selling now, right? And allocate the total cost according to my share of sales today. The other firm, who wasn't as smart, who fought against the regulation, had nothing to say about how to implement, how to find a solution for the cost allocation problem. Right? So at the end, basically, the actual recovery cost contribution of the first firm to the system is about 100. The better technology firm, the more recyclable product firm's contribution is 50, whereas the actual costs allocated were the exact opposite. So what we learned here is, along with many other examples related to execution or operationalizing these ideas, is that these kind of distortions in that marketplace in the form of regulation can actually be an opportunity for competitive advantage. By being present in the regulatory phase, by shaping the regulation, you can actually create a competitive advantage for yourself and even have others subsidize the recycling costs of your product. I'm not giving names for the companies, as you can see. We know who they are, but given that this is public, I don't want to be sued eventually. But what we learned here is this particular link between designing a regulation with a purpose and seeing the outcomes. Those two are somewhat decoupled unless you understand the operational features or the execution of these systems. All right? Does this make sense? Now, look at these figures and tell me if it makes sense for any of these firms to design their products, redesign their products so that they are more environmentally friendly. This was the eventual goal. This is why we hold the producer responsible, right? What is your answer? They're not going to design their products for recycling because the system on the ground in execution does not reward better product designs. It is purely based on whoever has a lower sales volume. So when we spoke with those producers, the only thing they told us they were doing was miniaturization. They were doing whatever they could to reduce the weight of their products so that the eventual cost that they would face would be lower.
Because it was charged per kilo, not
Exactly.
by the content of the bad things in the product.
Yeah. So this is where we came in. Luke mentioned that we have somehow influenced these regulations. So we wrote a few reports with white papers with the producers that are more like producer B in this example. We talked about creating systems that would allow individual producer responsibility. If producers wanted to separate from the collective systems, they would be giving the option. Because the initial form of regulation did not give them that option. Right? Second, we told regulators, especially in the UK, that they needed to redesign the cost allocation systems in a way that they would reward better product designs. Right? Those are not really rocket science ideas. They are very simple ideas. But you need some kind of an operational angle to anticipate what is happening on the ground so that you can influence these regulations to function in the way they are intended to be. Yes?
We have another question. So
this is completely hypothetical.
Ah, okay, okay.
This has nothing to do with the real numbers. This is just an example. I'm not actually using. But the cost of recycling a 200-pound LCD TV could be higher than $50.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. So it just depends pretty much on product characteristics and so on.
Just to have a better understanding, this was all the same for electronic products at the time. So, you know, you would pay to recycle a kilo or a ton. You would pay to recycle a kilo or a ton of mobile phones just as much as, you know, washing machine. A washing machine is costing. You wouldn't get a lot of benefit out of recycling it in terms of metals, maybe a bit. But in telephones, you have so many valuable metals that, you know, you got, what was it, 400 euros per ton, and they were paying rather than getting their money
There was
back.
gold, there was platinum, there were especially those with the touch screens. They would have other rare earth metals that are hard to get as well. But even with washing machines, other market forces were in place. Because before the washing machines made it to the formal recycling system, the motors, the copper material inside the washing machine had disappeared already. Same thing with refrigerators. Somehow, somebody was taking those away because copper is a very expensive commodity. It's 800 euros a ton. If you recycle it, that's what you're going to get out of it. It's very, very valuable. So, with fridges, with washing machines, with dishwashers, anything copper was already disappearing from the market. So, the collective systems worked to take care of the environmental externalities some way or another, but it did create an uneven competitive landscape across different parties. So what we learned here is, effectively, this is inevitable. You see in the consumer perspective, you told me that the majority, if not everybody, agrees that we need to do something about this, right? And you see that the governmental perspective or even the economic perspective dictates or mandates that producers take on responsibility. So there is no need to fight this regulation and put yourself in a difficult competitive place. What's more important is to shape the dynamics of how these regulations are going to take place, right? So for that, I can actually come back to the title of the talk, which I named Owls, Sheep, and Dodos. We have seen three types of companies out there. The first group called the Dodos. Do you know what a dodo is? Not everybody knows, so I actually picked up an example, an explanation of what it is. So this is an extinct bird, known to be inagile and unaware. Right? So in Mauritius, when the French arrived in the Mauritius Islands, they found out that there was this bird which didn't run away, and it actually tasted pretty good too. Within a few years, all dodos were gone, extinct. There are no more dodos on the planet. So there are many firms like this who are unaware and actually are not afraid or are not interested in shaping the landscape. So you don't want to be one of those. You don't want to be the sheep either as a follower, because what we have seen, especially in the context of the WEEE directive, is that one firm managed to influence one European commissioner to write the regulation with that market share-based allocation and the collective system, but it required 300 hands to change the regulation. It took us literally 8 years to move away from a collective system. And this was a lobbying effort by, I think, maybe 10 or 12 different electronics producers, big names out there. So it is very difficult to change the landscape once the regulation is cast in stone. So what you want to be is an owl who is aware, who is proactive, and who actually places the resources in the right place to influence the regulation. What's more important is you need to understand the operational dynamics so that you can influence the regulation in the best way possible. HP had invested in recycling facilities in anticipation of such regulation in California. They were the only company who had the recycling infrastructure. When California passed a law, they created a state system which would recycle and collect and recycle electronics in state-approved recyclers. How much did HP get out of those? HP's facilities were not part of the state system, so how much of a leverage can they get out of that? Another computer manufacturer claimed that we design our products to be recyclable, right? Who cares if you design your products to be recyclable? The recycling fee in California was $15 per computer. independent of your product design. So if you don't realize these implementation choices in place, then you're going to end up with suboptimal regulation that does not necessarily lead to the intended outcomes, but at the same time, a very distorted, uneven landscape for different producers. Does this make sense? So if there is one thing that you need to remember from the first part of this talk, this is exactly that, right? You don't want to be a dodo. You need to be aware and proactive. At the same time, you need to understand the execution on the ground. So this brings me to my original question. When I went to Luke's office, I told him, this is a regulation problem. I didn't think operations or supply chain people dealt with regulation. Why are you doing this? Of course, 15 years later, I understand. Because it is all about execution. It is why those electronics manufacturers came to INSEAD and came to talk to the operations group to understand what they needed to do. Make sense? So where is the circular economy in all of this? How does it relate to the circular economy? That's the real question, right? As many of you might know, the circular economy is a framework that has been put forward by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Have you heard of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation before? Or the circular economy movement before? If you didn't, you know what you are. What are you? Exactly, right? If you didn't think about what the circular economy means for your organization, for you, for your country, for your social impact venture, you're a sheep, okay? So my intention here is to make you owls, right? But the perspective I want to take is to say, look, when I see this butterfly diagram, which I will explain in a moment, I see the execution angle as an operations person. And I can actually identify impediments or potential opportunities for competitive power, competitive strength, or competitive opportunities in this framework. I need to understand how I'm going to execute this thing. So what these guys say is very simple, and it is something that many people have said in the past. What they're saying is create circular systems that would maintain the products for much longer time in use, right? That would maximize the utilization of resources so that firms or customers can generate the highest value possible from the natural resources that we have. So what do they mean by resource utilization maximization or extending the product life cycle? Well, I look at this with an operations hat on, right? So to that end, what they're saying is forget about this traditional I don't think the laser is working on this, so I'm going to have to point to those. Linear manufacturing system in which you would produce, sell, and let the fate of those products be decided by markets, right? So the extended producer responsibility idea, such as the electronics recycling regulation that I told you, suggests that at this point, when the customer is done with using the product, recycle it and bring it back in the material form into the market, right? So this is one form of resource efficiency. But what the Ellen MacArthur Foundation says is, it's not the most ideal one, right? Because if you bring the product back to the material form and reproduce it, you're losing a lot of energy, right? You're spending a lot of money for no reason. Instead of doing that, find ways to use that product longer and maximize its resource utilization. One example is to go for a sharing economy, right? As opposed to buying a car and trashing it later, where you use it maybe 1 hour a day, maybe an hour and a half a day. Switch it into an Uber-like system where the utilization would be maximized. That car would be around 16 hours a day as opposed to 1 hour a day, right? And it could be maintained better so that you can use it longer. And if the customers in your market are not appreciating that vehicle anymore, you can refurbish it and sell it to developing economies so that it can be used in a shared economy setting there and so on, right? So there is a preference order to creating the circularity. That's what the Ellen MacArthur Foundation says. Best thing you can do is to share, right? Lease, rent, right? Put it in Uber, something like that. If you can't do that, find a way to extend the life as much as you can. If you can't do that, then find ways to refurbish and new markets for those refurbished products and so on. The least you can do is to recycle, but that is the least preferred option in the end. Now, if you ask Luc, if you ask me what I thought about this 4 or 5 years ago, we would say, I mean, we've been saying this for a long time. Luc was saying it for 30 years, maybe. In my case, it's 15 years. But you know, when we say it, it doesn't sell well. But when they said it, it created a huge buzz out there in Europe, in the United States, in most of the developing or developed economies. What was the catch here? What did Ellen MacArthur Foundation do to make this more visible and interesting and appealing, not only to producers, but also to regulators? What did they say? They said that this is not about the environment. They said that this is about business. They said there's a lot of money that you're leaving on the table by not following these principles, these particular principles in that particular packing order that I shared with you. Right? The original report that was written with McKinsey said that firms could save up to $630 billion, euros per year, only in the European manufacturing industry alone. Right? Then Accenture came in and said 1.8 trillion. Not the last Accenture report is, I think, 4.3, something like that.
Oh, you're forgetting the millions of jobs that will be created.
Of course. Right? So now, this sounds very appealing, and this actually caught a lot of attention from the industry. I attended Ellen MacArthur Foundation workshops, beautiful workshops, a lot of industry engagement, and there were a lot of owls there. Owls in the sense that firms realized that this is going to be big because the pitch is really from a business angle. It doesn't create a conflict between the environmentalist point of view and the business point of view. So when these two come together, this is going to work out, right? So if you go to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website, you're going to see many firms declaring commitments, especially in the plastics context, on which Catel is going to talk a little bit later, right? And they are committing to following the ideals here. Not only that, but also if you look at the European Commission, the WEEE directive that I have been talking about earlier has a new name now, or has an extended scope. Do you know what it is called? Take a guess. The Circular Economy Directive. Have you heard about the Circular Economy Directive? If you didn't, you know what you are. But smart firms realize that this is going to change the landscape, and they want to be at the forefront of what this means. They want to follow, influence, predict, and perhaps also shape how circular economy is going to be implemented out there. Me, on the other hand, I see great potential for research here, especially with my operations hat on, right? And this dates back to my original example that I shared with you at the beginning of the talk. Remember, my involvement in closed-loop supply chains started in 2003 with this single-use camera. And I told you that this was the possibly best example of a circular economy model in the sense that this single-use camera can be used many, many times, right, without any market constraints. But my research at the time was to say that, look, this is not as easy, even for the simplest, easiest to sell circular economy idea. And here's why. If I were to create the simple, a simple supply chain representation of this business model, it looks something like this. I'm going to produce the camera, the manufacturing box. I'm going to sell them to meet some demand, right? After I sold those to the customers, what is going to happen? Those cameras, some of them will be taken to the studios that I'm collaborating with or cooperating with, right? But not all of them, right? Some of them will disappear. They will not be used. They will be thrown away. They will somehow disappear. Now, if a studio that I'm in partnership with gets access to that camera, then it's going to be taken to a remanufacturing facility. Will I be able to remanufacture everything that I have collected? I cannot, because the camera cannot be designed to be infinitely durable. There is going to be some limitation on the number of times that I can use those components, reuse those components, right? Make sense? So then if I am able to refurbish a camera, will I be able to sell it? For sure. I won't be able to sell it either because I continuously introduce newer generations of cameras, right? So an older technology, a lower focus lens or a lower power flash, is not going to be accepted by the customers at the end, right? So this basically says that there are three key operational forces or constraints that limit the circularity, even in the best case, the best known example out there. And my paper, my research paper, was about understanding how much of an impact these things had on the circularity, on the maximum circularity that is being promoted by frameworks such as the Circular Economy Framework of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So the next 30 minutes is going to be spent on explaining these equations. If you're with me, are you interested?
You don't have time.
Okay, so then I'm going to skip to the final slide, where I'm going to say this is the key number. Do you see that 58%? This is the best. Now, that's what that paper proved. This is the best that Kodak could do in terms of the circularity. The maximum fraction of circularity in that best case scenario was 58%, meaning 42% of the sales that Kodak generates in the life cycle of one camera has to be from new products. The remaining 58% of the sales can be generated by recirculating those cameras over and over up to the durability limit, the market limit, or the access limit in the end. Right? So what I see here is, the circular economy framework is fantastic. We are thinking about maybe we can create these infinite loops that we can use forever, right? The sunlight is over there, so we have infinite amount of energy, billions of years of energy for us, right? But if you think about the limitations as to access, limitations as to product design or technology, right? Or even customers' expectations from products themselves, we are bound to suffer from significant limitations on the circular economy. So it's a great idea. I support it wholeheartedly, right? We need to do more about this, but we need to understand these limitations before we invest in a circular economy. We need to get this operational perspective out there so that we can leverage these opportunities the best way possible. Okay? Make sense? So I had plenty of examples to show you where this could go wrong, but maybe I can pick one. I think this is a good one. Anybody from Germany here?
No, Germany, Eastern Europe.
Okay, what is this called?
Trabant.
What is the Trabant? Can you tell us?
A car produced in Eastern Germany, but was supplied also in of the Eastern Europe, made of cardboard. And I don't remember these times, but if I remember what my parents told, people had to wait for a long time to get one.
Okay. I heard those are really popular these days too.
Oh, they're
So I think this is a good example of a hypothetical circular economy, right? Well, it's a car that has been produced 50 years ago. Actually, maybe 60, 70 years ago, who knows? Right? No, not 70. Yeah, 49, possible. I don't know exactly. I don't know exactly when it started, but essentially one thing you see is that if we create these systems which create products that can be used forever, we might end up with a lot of Trabants out there in the marketplace, right? So we need to realize that consumers demand new things, new technologies come in, and actually, from an environmental point of view, the circular product could actually be bad. This is probably the highest emission generating, highest polluting car out there, right? So technology evolves, markets evolve, right? Business models evolve. The investments or the appealing nature of the circular economy has also to be judged by these limitations out there. So what we want to say is, hey, it's a great idea, go for it, we support it wholeheartedly, but we're more than happy to help identify the limitations to those. If we understand the constraints or the limitations on the execution of circular economy, we are going to be able to create better circular models out there. And that's what the INSEAD faculty takes pride with, as far as I can say. Now, before I pass it on to Katal, I'm going to show you one graph on where I actually position my research. So I do work on recycling, refurbishing, the circular economy, and so on, but a lot of my work actually deals with inequalities or other energy issues as well. And many of my colleagues, I can speak on behalf of my own area, do work in different parts and components of this as well. So INSEAD, and especially the Technology and Operations Group, is more than happy to support the SDGs in the best way we can, keeping in mind that we are good at understanding the devil in the details, and we will continue to work on the devil in the details in the very near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Atalay, for this presentation. I don't know about you, but sometimes this conversation leaves me thinking, okay, what do I do now? Like more like nervous and guilty, as you were saying about like, what can I do? What we see at INSEAD is that the guild has turned into engaged research for decades with the work of Luc van Vansenhoef, Atalay, and many others in the school. But as a citizen, what can we do? So we thought about that with a small group of very engaged alumni. And 2 hours ago, right before that session started, because we are also Black Friday, so we thought, what can we do to try and make a difference? You received an email in your inbox inviting you to join the first INSEAD Community Impact Challenge. The idea through that challenge is to try and test the extent to which, as a community of students, faculty members, staff, and alumni, we can try to make a difference. And we'll be focusing on stopping our use of single-use plastic for 1 month in January to see how we can change our behaviors collectively, and then we'll collect information about the learnings that we have achieved through that experiment. So I all encourage you to join that challenge, try it, join it, give us some data so that we can analyze and see how we can contribute. And you can take it at different levels. You have a number of items you can choose to reduce or completely stop using for a month. You can decide to take the challenge as an individual. You can take it as a family, or you can try to push it in your company or your organization. So that's one way of trying to turn the guilt into collective action and try to show as a community of participants what we can do. It's a pilot. If it works, we can try it beyond single-use plastic. We can try it maybe around chemicals or components that are in the things that we buy. But this is something that I wanted to let you know. Go back to your computer and sign on through that email. Thank you very much. We'll see you on Monday on the 2 campuses to continue with such presentation during the SDG week. And have a good weekend. Bye.
C'est bien, on a eu moins de monde que je pensais qu'on aurait plus.
On a eu 100 personnes.